Okay. All right. So we were talking about the issue of lending out a book to somebody else. But we said you're not allowed to read your friend's book at his house, even on an occasional basis, because the concern is that because you don't know what his temperament is about his books, right? That's what we had said. And so he says, Dafka bisfarim hadin kain, mishum d'shchiach sheyikareu v'yiskalkalu, ubal hasfarim choshesh shemayikra bahem harbe ad sheyikaru merov mishmusham. I think that's what we're up to. Yeah. He says, only with books is this halacha true, because it's common that books will tear and get spoiled and get ruined. And the owner of the books may be worried that the other person, the person who is coming into his house and reading his books, may read his books and it will tear them. And therefore he may feel, I don't want anyone to read this book. But you are allowed to, like this is what we were talking about yesterday, you are allowed to wear your friend's talis. If you find it in shul, you can put it on without his knowledge. You're allowed to wear your friend's tefillin without his knowledge. And this is where we left off yesterday. There's not as much of a concern that they're going to get worn out. Because the wear time of a pair of tefillin or a talis is very short, and there's not as much of a concern that it's going to wear out over that short period of time. So amrinan denichale. So therefore, we say a person would prefer nichale leina sheyei asa mitzvah b'mamono b'makom she'en sham chisaron kis. We say that a person would be happy for a mitzvah to be done with his property when there's no financial loss to him. The dafka be'akrayvel b'kviyus aser, but that's only on an occasional basis, but not on a long-term basis. V'afilu be'akray dafka ba'osam makom. And even on that occasional basis, only if it's like you find a pair of tefillin in the base medrash, in the shul, whatever it is, then you can put it on. But to take it home with you, because you figure the guy's in Florida for 6 months, he's not going to know, he's not going to care, that would be asr. Because it could be that that's not what he wants. And that would constitute theft. So, in all cases, if the owner is accessible, you should ask him, may I borrow your tefillin? May I read your book? We don't rely on, I'm sure he's okay with it, in a situation where you do have the ability to ask him, right? So in today's world, if you know whose tefillin it is, even if the guy's not in shul, send him a WhatsApp and say, do you mind if I wear your tefillin? Now, if he doesn't respond, are you allowed to put it on? Yes, you're allowed to put it on. But as a courtesy, just say, I notice your tefillin's here. I forgot my tefillin at home. Do you mind if I put yours on? Just be prepared to get the answer. Now, kasvu aposkim duha din demutalita lulav shel chavero below das chavero. And the poskim write that this halacha applies to borrowing your friend's lulav on Sukkos. And he qualifies that in the parentheses, b'sha'ar yamim dekasher b'shaul, d'biyom rishon b'inu lachem sheyeh shalom mamish. But that's all days except the first day. Because the first day of Sukkos, it mamish has to belong to you. Kaven de'ein chashash kilkul b'meshanolo umina'anei abo. Since there's no fear that that it's going to get spoiled when you pick it up and you shake it. Lo dami l'sefer di'isahacha da'aser. And therefore it is dissimilar from the case of a book where there's a genuine concern that the fellow may may actually spoil the book. I'm just going to pick up the rule. What could possibly go wrong, right? What could possibly I double check the connection to the computer also. Send a note to Mati. Okay, sorry about that. And by the way, he says, "V'davka pam echas muter litla ulananeo bo kahalacha, aval lechol zayin yamim efshir demakbid v'aser." But that's only for that one day, for that one time that he wants to use it. But it could be that to take it all 7 days without his permission, that's not so clear that it's usher. I will tell you this, based on the way I see other people shaking their lulavim, I don't want you touching my lulav. Because have you seen the way some people shake their lulav? I can't believe it. They have no concept. They're literally, every time they shake the lulav, they're making the lulav puzzle, because they're breaking the leaves in half by shaking it. It's supposed to be a gentle shake. And some people get their aggressions out on their lulav. I don't know. So I don't agree with this halacha. With this, I would not want someone touching my lulav. But that it could be that that's just me, that I'm fastidious. So I don't think that I could protest if someone decided, unless I put a sign on my lulav, please don't borrow. That's also, that's right. That's right. If somebody does that, yeah, they should be. Okay. Kasav HaMishnah Brura, the Ha'olam Nohagin, Kishemotzian Sidr Tfila Umachzer Beves HaKnesses, Shalok Chenos Okidei Lihispalal Bo, the Eini Yodeya Heter Lazeh, the Maishna Sidr Misfarim Adkan Lashano. Mishnah Brura writes something really interesting in Siman Yud Daled. He says that people have a custom that if they find a sitter in the Beit HaKnesset that belongs to a private individual, that they'll go ahead and borrow it, and they'll daven from it. And he says, I don't know what the heter for this is. He says, I don't know what the heter is. We know that there's a halacha that you're not allowed to borrow svarim. So why is it okay to borrow your friend's sitter if he's not there? That's his question, okay? He says, V'yesh misha kasav. And now who's he quoting over here, Rav Stern? Because the Mishnah Berurah is quoting, and he's quoting the Aruch HaShulchan actually. He says, Dekepedas HaShulchan Aruch lo haya ela bizmanehem, that the concern of the Shulchan Aruch to borrow someone's sefer without their permission was only in those days. Masha'en king bizmanenu shahadefus zol. He says, but in our days, where printing is a very cheap, inexpensive endeavor, the efshar liknos siddur ba'ad ezamaos, and you can buy a siddur for a few bucks, less man de kapit al zeh. People are not mindful and people don't care about it as much as they used to. It's amazing how the prices of certain commodities have gone down because of technology. Before 1400, if you wanted a sitter, you'd have to hire a guy. It would take him a year to handwrite your sitter, and you'd pay a year's salary for a scribe. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine how rare Sidurim were? And if you had a sitter, maybe it had Shmona Esrei and Kriya Shema, right? Because just consider how expensive. And the shuls back then, they really did need to rely on Chazara Sashatz back then because people didn't have access to prayer books. They davened by heart. Like the Sephardim, they said everything out loud. That's why that developed, that custom. And then in later centuries, with the advent of the printing press, the technology was still very rudimentary when the printing press was first developed, because you'd have to put in all of it would take a year to typeset the press. But then you could mass produce. You could produce multiple Sidurim, but you'd still pay a fortune so that the guy who owned the printing press could recoup his costs of the paper, the labor, the ink, the binding. All of these things were just new technologies that were done by hand mostly. And the fact that you can buy a sitter today for $20 or less is just remarkable. It's just remarkable. So the only thing we have to worry about today is the high cost of food. But basically, you get everything else on the cheap. Okay, and even food is just incredibly accessible today. We've all but eliminated hunger except for political reasons, we've eliminated hunger from the world, which is also just remarkable. So anyway, it was only back then. He says, Ach im hasider hu yakar, o shar svarim yikarim, bazeh yesh li zoher gam bizman hazeh. But if the book is expensive, it's a very rare antiquarian, one-of-a-kind, first printing, it's the Gutenberg Bible, right? It's the first printed Bible. Or, a lot of people collect old books. And then if you see a guy that's what I was mentioning yesterday. If you go to someone's house and you see that they have a glass case with first edition books from the 1500s, the 1600s, so then you shouldn't touch those books unless you get permission. But if you find, just like he says, you can pick up someone's sitter in shul, it's no big deal. Similarly, today, if you go to someone's house, even if they're not there yet, and the butler tells you, please have a seat, my father will be home soon, and you sit down, there's nothing wrong with picking up a book off the shelf. If anything, the owner of the home wants you to read the book because it's such an inexpensive commodity today. So this changes the whole halacha, the technology. We fail to see how technology has changed our lives over the centuries, and it's changed halachic realities as well. Okay, so this is one example, even in Choshen Mishpat, where technology has changed the value of certain commodities. And I would say just the opposite. I would say nowadays, taking someone's lulav without their permission is more problematic than taking their book without permission. And remember, the only time that we can justify taking someone's object without their permission is based on the assumption that a person would like a mitzvah to be done with their property. What if it's an object that there's no mitzvah involved, right? Let's say a guy's got a video console in his house, a PS, what are they up to, PS4? Is it 4 or 5? I don't remember. No, they're not up to 6 yet. 6? PS5, okay. So he's got a PS5, and it's all hooked up, and you're chalashing to play the new game. Would you be allowed to play the PS5? That's not so pashut, because maybe he's got special settings on it, and yada this and yada that. I don't know. No, it's more than that, I think. I think they start at 1,000. Okay. Okay. So let's see the biurim over here. Likros sham misifro. Kasav harama. Choshen Mishpat sof simin kuf samach gimel. Nimtza b'takos kedumo shelo lahotzi talos osei from beis hakneses b'li rishus ha'ba'olam. That the Rama writes that it's one of the earlier takanos, earlier decrees, that you're never allowed to take a person's talis or siddur outside of the synagogue. Mashma milashonu dedafka lahotzi misham yesh iser avol likro b'makom shari. And it seems from the Rama's language that the only thing that you're not allowed to do is to remove it from the place, but to read it in its place is totally okay. So why did the he says this seems to be a contradiction to what we're learning. He says because in Siman Yadalid in Orachayim that you're allowed to, the Shulchan Aruch says you're allowed to use your friend's talis. But when it comes to books, the Ramah says you're not allowed to open up a friend's book without his knowledge. Because we're worried that maybe you'll tear a page while you're learning from it. V'imkein yeshli tmoa al harama madua hevi hatakana bisram lagabi iser hotzasam mibeis hakneses harei af b'makomam asul likro bahem. So why did the Rama only say that you can't remove a sefer from the synagogue? Even if you keep it in the synagogue, it's still going to be usher to read from it. He says, and that's why the Rav Shulchan Aruch paskins that way also. He says, the Gra writes that the reason why you're allowed to read the sefer in the synagogue is because when a person brings a sefer to the synagogue, it's implicit that he's allowing others to use it. And he quotes from a Gemara in Bava Metzia, the Harama Mayri Bisfarm Shuhubu Lebeis HaKnesses Aidei Habolim Shiyilmadu Bahem Shiyirtza. That the Rama is talking about a scenario which was probably prevalent, that people would bring their private svarim to the shul, and they would leave them in the shul with the understanding that if someone else wants to use it, they're perfectly welcome to. Because otherwise, why would you leave your siddur or your chumash in the shul? If you really cared about the sefer, you would bring it and then bring it home with you after you're done. And that's why the Rama writes that even though you're allowed to read it at that place, you're not allowed to take it out of the synagogue. And then he goes through the Gemara that the Gra cites. And we're not going to go through the whole piece because I think it's more of an academic piece. Just finish off. Okay. It's a very long piece that goes through the various different shitot. So we're not going to see that today. Let's go on to the next Imrei Yaakov. So we on page Reish Lamed Daled we had seen the Ein Tzarech Lomar Lihishtamesh B'Sha'ar Chafatzav. He says, you're not allowed to use your friend's sefer, your friend's book, without his knowledge. And that's true whether it's his book or whether he's borrowed it from someone else. Unless you know with absolute certainty that the owner doesn't mind. Perish the imbesefer shehu litzarach limud haTorah asrinan kal v'chomer bishar chafatzim shel rishus she'einam miyuadim l'kiyum mitzvah. So the point he's saying is that if you're not even allowed to borrow a sefer to learn Torah from, then certainly to borrow a widget, to borrow a lawnmower, to borrow anything else from your friend where there's no mitzvah involved, surely then you cannot borrow it unless you know with absolute certainty that he's happy for you to use it. Ela imken yadu lo beveirur shelo yakpid, b'davka b'davar shenishar kayam ve'eno nichle, ve'eno oseh imo ela hishtamshut yesh lahatir b'chei gavna. He says, and even then, without the owner's awareness, let's say you say, I know for certain that he doesn't mind. It must be a durable commodity that through its use, it's still intact. And you're only going to be using it in such a way where it's not compromising the integrity of the object. Avol bedavar shenichle, but if with every use, it gets used up, Gam im barur lo hadavar shekeshe yivoda lebalav shuhu natla azayismechu mipnei ahavasam oso. He says if it's a usable commodity, there's plenty of examples that we could give where every time you use it, it gets used up. So even if you know that the owner would be happy for you to use it, asur lo lehanos mimena below das habalam, then you must get express permission. L'chidekasav harav le'el simen daled sif daled, dehanichnas lepardes oginas chaveiro, asur lo lilkot pero shalomi das habalam. So for example, we saw back in simen daled in the Imrei, in the Rav Shulchan Aruch, is that if you go into your friend's property and you see he's got an orchard and there's fruit on the trees and he's not home, in that scenario, you want an apple and he's got apples on his trees, of course he'd be delighted for you to have an apple, that he would get such pleasure out of knowing that you ate one of his apples. But if he's never given you permission to pull off an apple off of his tree, you must get express permission from the owners who's present and tells you, please go ahead and have an apple, or at least call him on the phone, right? And that's even if you know that he would want you, because he loves you, he's such a good friend of yours, and he would want you to have an apple, but you can't take something that's a consumable that gets used up unless you get explicit permission from the owner. Right. So we did learn before that in many, if not most instances, a wife is considered to be a representative of the husband. There was a question that we had when it came to tzedakah. Is a shliach mitzvah allowed to accept a check from the wife? And the conclusion of most poskim was that nowadays that's okay. There is an understanding that a wife does have free reign over the household assets. So if the wife gives permission, then it's okay. A minor child, not so clear that a minor child has that jurisdiction. We'll hold it here for today. I'll try and figure out what the problem is, and we'll, it's Hashem, have